Nomsa laughed through tears and lifted her glass as the room murmured its toast. She drank. Almost at once her voice caught oddly mid-sentence. A flicker of confusion crossed her face. She tried to wave it off, asking for a second, saying she felt strange, but her hand had already begun to tremble on the stem of the glass and her words were starting to slur. Karabo's smile dropped instantly as he reached for her, calling her name, asking what was wrong. She managed only a few broken words about her head before her knees buckled and the glass shattered on the marble floor. Chaos broke over the room. Karabo caught her before she hit the ground. Mama Dineo pushed through the crowd, screaming for someone to call an ambulance. Karabo cradled her, begging her to stay with him as help came. Across the room, at the drinks table, Nolwazi stood frozen, glass still in her own hand, and for one unguarded second, before her face remembered what it was supposed to do, something in her looked almost peaceful. Then she snapped into motion, rushing forward, her voice pitched a half-second too late into practiced hysteria, crying out in horror at what was happening to her friend. But that moment didn't begin in that room. It started long before anyone realized what was coming. To understand why everything fell apart, the story has to go back to where it all truly began. Nomsa and Nolwazi had been inseparable since primary school in Soweto. Two girls who shared one umbrella in the rains and one dream in the dry season, to leave the cramped flat shares of their childhoods and build something bigger. Nolwazi's father had left when she was 6. Nomsa's mother, Mama Dineo, had folded Nolwazi into their home so often the neighbors sometimes forgot which girl belonged to which family. They grew up trading secrets and safety pins, showing up at each other's exam halls with rooibos flasks and forehead kisses for luck. When Nomsa's father died during their university years, Nolwazi slept on the floor of her res room for a week so she wouldn't wake up alone. When Nolwazi was passed over for a promotion she'd worked 18 months to earn, Nomsa marched into the HR office beside her, refusing to let her friend fight alone. By 29, the friendship had the weight of family. Nomsa had built a growing event planning business. Nolwazi worked in brand marketing at a Santon firm, sharp, well-liked, always the loudest laugh at the table, and always quietly watching what other people had. It started small, a flicker of comparison when Nomsa's business landed its first big client, a tightening in Nolwazi's chest scrolling through Nomsa's warm, easy-looking life online. Nolwazi never said any of this aloud, not even to herself. She called it ambition. She called it drive. She told herself wanting more had nothing to do with what her best friend had. She was wrong, and it would cost more than either of them could yet imagine. Nomsa called Nolwazi glowing with excitement, unable to keep the news in. Karabo had asked her to marry him, and she had said yes before he'd even finished the sentence. Nolwazi's smile formed half a second too late, but her voice carried the right notes of joy and disbelief. Later that night, alone, Nolwazi called back with her voice carefully too calm, asking when he was actually going to put a ring on it, needling gently at whether it was one of those promise engagements. Nomsa, oblivious, laughed it off. They were picking the ring out together the following week, she said, because he wanted her to choose it herself. Nolwazi's laugh in response was bright and utterly hollow. She said it was so romantic, made an excuse to go, and hung up before Nomsa could respond. Alone, she sat in silence, staring at the darkened phone screen. In the weeks that followed, Nolwazi told herself she was simply busy. She let messages sit unanswered for days instead of minutes. She missed the ring shopping trip, inventing a deadline that didn't exist. She scrolled past the engagement photos again and again, always landing on Karabo's face. Nolwazi had met Karabo first. 2 years earlier, at a mutual friend's housewarming in Melville, she and Karabo had spent nearly an hour talking about ambition and the particular loneliness of building something from nothing. She had felt a pull that night. She introduced him to Nomsa a month later, certain, in the arrogant way of people who have never been tested, that some things simply weren't in competition. She was wrong. Karabo looked at Nomsa and never looked away again. Nolwazi began researching quietly, telling herself it was nothing more than late-night curiosity. symptoms of gradual poisoning, substances undetectable in standard toxicology panels. She had no plan yet. She told herself fiercely that she never would. But something in her had already curdled. Envy that had spent 2 decades disguising itself as love, finally showing its true shape. Once a thing shows its true shape, it rarely goes back into hiding. Over tea at a cafe in Rosebank, Nomsa admitted she'd been drained for 2 weeks straight, headaches every day. Karabo convinced she was overworking herself. Nolwazi stirred her tea slowly, not quite meeting her eyes, and suggested it was probably just stress. Weddings did that to people, and offered to take some of the vendor calls off her plate. Nomsa squeezed her hand gratefully, telling her she was the only person she trusted with any of it, that she didn't know what she'd do without her. For half a second, Nolwazi's smile flickered before settling back into place. Nolwazi made herself indispensable. She took over the vendor calls, cooked meals during the busiest weeks, brought over a detox tea she said her aunt in Durban swore by. Nomsa drank it gratefully, night after night, touched by her friend's care. The headaches worsened. Dizziness came next, then a numbness in her fingertips she waved off as poor circulation. Dr. Modiz ran a basic panel and found nothing alarming. Mild anemia, mild dehydration, the ordinary complaints of an overworked bride. He told her to rest, drink more water, worry less. No one thought to test for what wasn't supposed to be there. Karabo noticed the changes first, the hollowness under her eyes, the way her sentences trailed off. He gently suggested a specialist, suggested she slow down. Nomsa laughed him off, insisting there was too much left to do and too little time. Nolwazi watched these conversations with a perfected expression of concern and warmth, the face of a woman who loved her friend fiercely. Beneath it, something colder kept its own quiet count. Not enough yet. Just enough to make her tired, make her small, make room. She told herself, still, that this was as far as it would go, right up until the night of the engagement dinner, when she decided it wasn't far enough at all. Parked outside Nomsa's apartment one evening, Karabo called Nolwazi, voice tight with worry, asking whether Nomsa had mentioned feeling worse. Nolwazi, composed and reassuring, told him brides just got run down sometimes. Her own cousin had lost so much weight before her wedding she'd barely recognized her. Karabo exhaled, rubbing his forehead, admitting he had a feeling he couldn't quite explain but couldn't shake either. Nolwazi told him gently that his worry only proved how much he loved her, and that he should let Nomsa rest and let her handle the wedding stress. She had it covered. He believed her, and the doubt, for the moment, went quiet. On the morning of the dinner, Nolwazi arrived early to help set up, as she always did. She carried the wine in herself, insisting the caterers not touch her special selection, a case of champagne she claimed had come from a friend's wine farm trip to Stellenbosch. She had spent 3 nights preparing what she told herself was only a precaution. But standing in Nomsa's kitchen that morning, watching Mama Dinio fuss over the table, watching everyone orbit around Nomsa like she was the sun and always had been, something in Nolwazi finally fully broke. She excused herself to the bathroom and, with hands steadier than she expected, added the compound to a single flute, marking it with the smallest scratch on the base. She had called it insurance for weeks. That night she stopped pretending. At the party she performed warmth flawlessly, toasting Nomsa's beauty, embracing Karabo's mother, calling her future family. And when Karabo rose with his glass and the room turned toward the woman they loved, Nolwazi was already moving, already lifting the marked flute, already crossing the room with the rehearsed smile, insisting the bride shouldn't have to lift a finger tonight. Nomsa took the glass without a second thought. Why would she? Nolwazi had never given her a reason to. What happened next, the room would replay for months. Nolwazi stood exactly where she'd stood 100 times before, close enough to help, far enough to watch. For one unguarded second, something in her chest went quiet and still and almost peaceful. Then she screamed her friend's name and ran toward her like everyone else, and no one in that room thought to look at her twice. In the hospital corridor, Mama Dineo sat shaking, unable to understand how her daughter could have been laughing that very morning and now be fighting for her life. Dr. Modise emerged through the doors, his expression grave, and told them gently but plainly that Nomsa's blood work was showing something that shouldn't be there. Karabo demanded to know what he meant. Dr. Modise explained carefully that this wasn't stress and it wasn't anemia. Someone had given her something and the police needed to be called. Detective Minkosi arrived within the hour, his notebook already half full of names. The guest list, the caterers, the wine supplier. Forensics traced the toxin to a single champagne flute, still bearing a faint scratch at its base. The compound was unusual enough that his team ran it against a database of recent local purchases and searches. 11 days passed. Nomsa lay unconscious for the first 3, then slowly began to surface. Karabo slept in a plastic chair beside her bed. Mama Dineo prayed in the hallway. Nowazi visited daily with flowers and tears that looked exactly like grief. On the 12th day, Detective Nkosi called everyone who'd had access to the drinks table in for formal statements, framing it as routine. Nowazi arrived composed and sympathetic, repeating the same story she'd told a dozen times. She had only helped set up. She had been horrified. She loved Nomsa like a sister. It was a junior officer who found a specialty supplier account registered under Nowazi's work email, tied to a delivery address 3 blocks from her apartment. It was Detective Nkose, reviewing her search history under warrant, who found weeks of queries about undetectable toxins and dosage timelines, including one made 4 days before the dinner, asking how long poison took to show symptoms. He set the printout on the table between them and watched, for the first time, the composed grief on Nowazi's face begin to genuinely crack. Detective Nkosi asked her to explain why her name was on an order for a substance banned for personal purchase in the country. Nowazi's hands twisted in her lap as she insisted weakly that she had only been researching for an article, for work, that it didn't mean anything more. He told her plainly that her search history said otherwise, and so did the scratch on the glass pulled from her hand in 3 separate photographs from that night. Something in her broke completely. She said he didn't understand what it was like to watch someone take everything you ever wanted and not even notice they'd done it. Crying openly now, she admitted she hadn't wanted Nomsa dead. She had only wanted her to slow down long enough for someone to finally see her. Detective Nkosi's expression stayed level. He told her Nomsa could have died on that floor in front of everyone who loved her, all because Nowazi had wanted to be seen. She put her head in her hands, shoulders shaking, undone. He signaled to the officer at the door and placed her under arrest for attempted murder. The story broke before her first court appearance. Within days, her name was inescapable across blogs and social feeds. The same platform she had once scrolled through with envy, now dissecting her betrayal in real time. Her employer suspended her within 48 hours and terminated her once it emerged she had used a company laptop to research the toxin, the timestamps damning and admissible. 8 years of career gone in a single memo. Her own mother, who had once cooked dinner beside Mama Dineo in that cramped Soweto home, could not look at her during their one prison visit. She told Nowazi she had raised her in that woman's house and left without another word. Karabo never once visited her. He spoke her name publicly only once, at her sentencing, saying he hoped that wherever she ended up, she would find the kind of self-worth that didn't require destroying someone else's happiness to feel real. She was sentenced to 14 years. In a cell far smaller than the life she had tried to steal, Nowazi had nothing left to research, nothing left to plan, no one left performing warmth back at her. Only the silence she had spent a lifetime running from, and the mirror she could no longer avoid. The very thing she had poisoned her best friend to obtain, being seen, mattering more than anyone else in the room, she achieved completely. Every stranger who read about her knew exactly who she was. It was simply not the kind of seeing she had ever wanted. A year later, an outdoor wedding unfolded in the cradle of humankind countryside. Karabo stood at the altar as Nomsa walked toward him, radiant and fully recovered, Mama Dineo beaming from the front row. At the reception, Karabo raised his glass and echoed the toast from a year before, steadier now, certain, saying he had almost lost the reason he stood there at all, and that he would never again take a single second of it for granted. Nomsa lifted her own glass, poured and chosen by her own hand this time, laughing freely among people she trusted completely, and offered a toast of her own, to the people who show you who they really are, and to finally listening. The whole table raised their glasses with her. Nomsa never spoke Nolwazi's name at the wedding. She didn't need to. Every guest there had lived the story alongside her. What she carried instead was a lesson she would one day pass to her own daughter. When the little girl asked why Auntie Nolwazi never came around anymore, that love which watches for your downfall was never love at all, only envy wearing love's clothes. That people who quietly celebrate your setbacks rarely show it loudly. They show it in silence, in absence, in the moments they hope you never notice. And that the truest kind of friendship, the kind Mama Dineo had modeled her whole life, opening her home to a lonely little girl with nothing to offer back, asks for nothing in return but honesty. Nolwazi had wanted more than anything to be the woman standing at the center of a room full of people who loved her. In the end, she got exactly what she chased, just not the way she meant to chase it. Because the truth always finds the center of the room eventually, and stands there in full view, whether you invited it or not.